In the early morning hours of November 29, 1966, the freighter Daniel J. Morrell was fighting her way through a violent storm on Lake Huron. 2 days earlier, she departed Buffalo, New York, bound for Taconite, Minnesota, where she would pick up one last load of iron ore for the season. But little did her crew know that in just a matter of time, the aging freighter would succumb to that fierce witch of November and become one of the largest shipwrecks in the history of the Great Lakes. Our story begins at the turn of the 20th century, when the United States experienced a massive industrial boom, and the Great Lakes were churning out record amounts of steel. With the growing demand for the raw materials in the region needed to make steel, the Cambria Steamship Company, a division of the Cambria Iron Company, was founded in 1906 to operate ships that could transport iron ore from the mines surrounding Lake Superior down to the steel mills on Lake Erie. The company soon ordered 2 nearly identical freighters. The first one would be built by the Superior Shipbuilding Company in Superior, Wisconsin, while the other would be built by the West Bay Shipbuilding Company in West Bay City, Michigan. The first ship, labeled Hull number 515, was launched on August 18, 1906, and she was named the Edward Y. Townsend, after the former president of the Cambria Iron Company. And 4 days later, on August 22nd, her sister ship, labeled Hull number 619, was launched. She was named the Daniel J. Morrell, after the former general manager of the Cambria Iron Company, who also served 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives from Pennsylvania from 1867 to 1871. He passed away on August 20th, 1885, at the age of 64. Both ships shared the title Queen of the Lakes when they were launched. The Daniel J. Morrell came in at 7,239 gross tons and measured 603 feet or 184 meters in length. Her sister, the Edward Y. Townsend, came in at 7,438 gross tons and measured 602 feet or 183 meters in length. The Morrell was powered by 2 Scotch Marine boilers which fueled a triple expansion steam engine driving a single propeller. Both the Morrell and the Townsend held the title Queen of the Lakes for the next 4 months, being surpassed by the freighter William B. Kerr, which was launched on December 29, 1906. In fact, a total of 6 ships held the title in 1906. Although the Morrell was the largest ship on the lakes at the time, her design still followed the blueprints that built nearly every lake freighter at the time. But still, she and her sister would have long and successful careers. It's now late September 1906, and the Daniel J. Morrell is fully completed and ready for service. She departed the shipyard in Bay City, Michigan on September 24th, bound for Lake Superior, where she would pick up her first load of iron ore. She steamed north through Lake Huron and the St. Mary's River before reaching Sault Ste. Marie. When the ship arrived at the Sioux Lock, she was greeted by huge crowds eager to watch the brand new, largest ship on the Great Lakes pass through on her way to Lake Superior. She then arrived in Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, where she took on her first cargo of iron ore. After departing Taconite Harbor, she set a course for Buffalo, New York, where her cargo was unloaded and was delivered to her owners, the Cambria Iron Company. And this would be her usual route throughout her career. In the first few months of their careers, the Morrell and the Townsend were breaking new records for the most cargo carried by a freighter on the Great Lakes. 2 years later, in 1908, the Cambria Steamship Company chartered the 2 ships to be operated by the M.A. Hanna Company. Afterward, the hulls and funnels of the Morrell and Townsend were repainted black to match the livery of the M.A. Hanna Company. The company operated the 2 ships until 1927, when they were transferred to the Bethlehem Transportation Company, a division of the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, which absorbed the Cambria Iron Company in 1930, and the hulls and funnels of the Morrell and the Townsend were repainted their original colors. Aside from that, the Daniel J. Morrell enjoyed a relatively uneventful career, with a few exceptions. On August 13, 1909, while sailing through a heavy fog bank on Whitefish Bay, she collided with the 600-foot freighter Henry Phipps. Luckily, both ships were repaired and returned to service. In November 1958, while sailing through a storm on Lake Superior, she suffered damage to her hull that required some repairs. Ironically, this was the same storm that took down the SS Carl D. Bradley. In 1959, while she was taking on cargo in Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, the equipment caused slight damage to her hull, and the same thing happened again in 1960. But still, the Daniel J. Morrell had a very productive and successful career. In fact, in 1922, the Sperry Gyroscope Company installed a gyro compass on the Morrell, making her the first ship on the Great Lakes to use a gyro compass. She was then reboilered in 1945, placing her old Scotch boilers with 2 water tube Babcock and Wilcox boilers. She was reboilered once again in 1956 with a 3-cylinder Skinner Uniflow engine, and this nearly doubled her original horsepower. By 1966, the Daniel J. Morrell and her sister were going on 60 years of service, and that year, the Morrell underwent 3 Coast Guard safety inspections, with her final one taking place on July 20th, and she easily passed all 3 of them. Although the ship was showing her age, it seemed to her crew and her owners that she would navigate the Great Lakes well into the future. In late November 1966, the Daniel J. Morrell, under the command of Captain Arthur Crowley, was docked in Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, taking on a load of iron ore. This was to be the Morrell's final voyage of the season, but as fate would have it, while she was loading, Captain Crowley received a call from his company offices in Cleveland. They told him that the Morrell would need to make one more trip carrying iron ore, since one of their freighter's engines had broken down. so they told Crowley that the Morrell had to make one more trip of the season so they could meet their tonnage quotas. Not long after, she departed with her cargo bound for Buffalo, New York. The Morrell entered the St. Clair River at around 11 a.m. on November 25th, and around the same time, she passed by another vessel. On board that vessel was a photographer by the name of Thomas Sikora, who took a photo of the Morrell as she passed by. And then, at around 5 p.m. that same day, while she was steaming down the Detroit River, another photographer named Emery Massman took a photo of the Morrell as she passed by. And these are the last known photos ever taken of the vessel. The Morrell and her sister, the Townsend, arrived in Buffalo that night. However, the freighter had to wait for 2 ships to finish unloading their cargo before the Morrell could unload hers. Since it would likely be a while before the Morrell could start unloading, let alone finish unloading, several crew members decided to leave the ship for some time in order to spend time with family and friends or see some sights. One of those crew members was 26-year-old deck watchman Dennis Hale. Hale joined the crew of the Daniel J. Morrell in the spring of 1964 as a deck watchman. When he joined, he was unsure if the vessel was seaworthy. He even reported that she was full of dirt and cobwebs, and that whenever he went below deck, he always found leaks in her hull. Not to mention, she had been in long-term layup in Erie, Pennsylvania for several years at that point, and the decision had just been made to return her to service. Despite all of this, he grew to love life on the lakes, and even made some good friends on the Morrell. Once he realized that it would be a while before the Morrell could unload, he decided to take a quick trip to Ashtabula, Ohio, where he could spend some time with his family. Along with him was one of his shipmates, John Graw, and on the way, Hale dropped him off at his home in Erie, Pennsylvania. However, the Morrell was unloaded quicker than Hale had originally thought. He arrived in Buffalo on the evening of November 26, just in time to see the Daniel J. Morrell clear the harbor. He and his shipmate, John Graw, who also missed the ship, then went to the Coast Guard station to radio the ship. Luckily, the ship was scheduled to take on a load of coal at the Mullen Dock in Windsor, Ontario the next day. Hale and Graw figured they could join the ship there, so they made the long trip to Ontario where they would board the Daniel J. Morrell for her final run of the season. The Daniel J. Morrell departed Buffalo, New York on the evening of November 26. This was to be her 34th and final voyage of the 1966 season. On this voyage, she had no cargo, and her ballast tanks were filled to keep her steady. She was bound for Taconite Harbor, Minnesota, where she would pick up one last load of iron ore for the season. At 3:10 a.m., around 4 hours later, the Morrell's sister ship, the Townsend, under the command of Captain Thomas Connolly, had finished unloading her cargo in Buffalo and had departed bound for Taconite Harbor as well. As the Morrell made her way across Lake Erie, she encountered choppy seas, gale-force winds, and snow flurries, but it was nothing the massive freighter couldn't handle. However, at around 6 p.m., while she was sailing north through the Detroit River, her crew decided to drop anchor and wait out the storm. Just after 11 p.m., her sister, the Edward Y. Townsend, had passed the Morrell, which was still anchored in the river. The Townsend had also taken a beating in the storm, but she was holding on. After passing her sister ship, Captain Connolly of the Townsend radioed Captain Crowley of the Morrell and told him that he would continue sailing north into the St. Clair River and anchor near Stag Island. And just before 7 a.m. on the morning of November 27th, the Morrell raised anchor and began steaming north toward the Mullen Dock, where she would take on a load of coal. Dennis Hale and John Graw arrived at the Mullen Dock in Windsor, Ontario at 11 a.m. that same morning. However, the Morrell was nowhere to be seen. She wouldn't arrive until 3 a.m. on the morning of November 28th. While docked, she took on a load of 221 tons of coal for her final leg of the voyage. Hale and Graw joined the vessel while she was loading. The Morrell departed the Mullen Dock at 7:30 that same morning and began her trip north into Lake Huron. At 1 a.m. that afternoon, the Morrell passed her sister ship, the Townsend, which had been anchored there since 4 a.m. that morning. The Morrell entered Lake Huron later that afternoon. The southern part of the lake was relatively mild, but as the Morrell steamed north, she faced winds of up to 65 miles per hour, blinding snow, and 20 to 25-foot waves that battered the massive freighter with relentless force. And the weather only continued to get worse over the next several hours, with the Michigan side of Lake Huron being hit with a massive blizzard. The Townsend had raised anchor around the same time, and soon made it into Lake Huron, where she would trail her sister by around 15 miles. Both ships were rolling heavily in the storm, and at 8:30 p.m., Captain Connolly of the Townsend radioed Captain Crowley on the Morrell to discuss the weather, and he told Crowley that he was just passing Harbor Beach, Michigan, near the mouth of Saginaw Bay. He also told Crowley that he would reduce his ship's speed to stabilize her. The two captains radioed each other again at around 10 p.m., both concerned about the safety of their ship. Connolly reported that the Townsend was groaning and creaking with every wave that struck her, putting massive strain on her hull as she rolled violently. The Daniel J. Morrell, still about 15 miles ahead, was experiencing the same conditions. At 11:15 p.m., the two captains once again made radio contact. Although the two ships were weathering the storm, Captain Connolly on the Townsend told Captain Crowley that he would seek shelter in Thunder Bay near Alpena, Michigan, where she would anchor and wait out the storm. While the two captains were talking on the radio, another captain joined the call. It was Captain James Van Buskirk of the freighter Benson Ford, which was sailing downbound through Lake Huron with a cargo of iron ore. The Ford had just left Thunder Bay, and Captain Van Buskirk told the captains of the Morrell and the Townsend that the bay would provide the two ships some shelter from the storm. Captain Van Buskirk soon signed off, and Captain Connolly considered his suggestion, but he decided to hug the shore instead. At 12:15 a.m. on the morning of November 29th, Captain Connolly called Captain Crowley once again. The ships were being punished by gale-force winds and towering waves that came in 250 to 300-foot intervals repeatedly crashed over their deck, making it difficult for both ships to stay on course as they rolled and pitched heavily in the maelstrom. At this point, the Morrell was leading the Townsend by about 20 miles, and both captains shared the same concerns. The two skippers then wished each other good luck and signed off, but little did Captain Connolly know, in less than 2 hours, the Daniel J. Morrell and her 29 crew would be in a fight for survival. At 9:30 p.m. on the evening of November 28th, deck watchman Dennis Hale, who had just finished his shift 90 minutes earlier, returned to his cabin for the night. His cabin was located in the bow section of the Daniel J. Morrell on the starboard side. He crawled into his bed and began reading Carl Sandburg's Lincoln, which his sister Jean had recommended to him for this trip. At 10 p.m., he turned off his light and began to fall asleep. His next shift would start at 4 a.m. the following morning. The Morrell's pitching and rolling in the waves didn't bother him, as he was used to the movements of ships in rough seas, and he had no idea of what he was going to experience in just a few hours. At around 2 a.m. on the morning of November 29th, Dennis Hale was awakened by a loud bang from somewhere in the ship. At first, he thought it was the anchor hitting the side of the ship, but then, as he was beginning to fall back asleep, he heard another bang, much louder than the first one, and his books began to fall off the shelf above his bed. He then tried to turn on the lights in his cabin, but they didn't come on. He sat on his bed for a few moments before the ship's general alarm began sounding. Wearing only his boxer shorts and a life jacket, Hale went up to the spar deck to see what was going on. When he reached the spar deck, he came across another crew member, Al Womey. He shouted, "Oh my God." Hale looked toward the aft end of the ship. The lights in the forward section of the ship were out, but he could see the lights of the stern in the darkness. He saw that the Morrell was hogging in the middle, with the stern lifting and falling of the waves, separate from the bow. At this point, it became clear to Hale as to what happened. The Daniel J. Morrell had broken in two. The break was located between the 11th and 12th hatch. Hale then raced back to his cabin to find more clothes. On his way, he ran into watchman Norman Bragg. 13 years earlier, Bragg had survived the sinking of the SS Henry Steinbrenner on Lake Superior, and he gave Hale and a few other crew members some tips on how to survive. Hale soon reached his cabin. He searched for more clothes, but all he could find in the darkness was a wool peacoat. The temperature outside was 33 degrees Fahrenheit, and he knew that without more protection, he could suffer from hypothermia. He also had no shoes on, and the decks were covered in a thick layer of ice and slush. With the ship breaking up from underneath him, Hale and a few of his shipmates went to one of the inflatable pontoon life rafts which was stored in the bow of the ship. The rafts were designed to float off the ship when she sank, so Hale and a few other crew members sat in the boat while waiting for the ship to submerge beneath them. The group was soon joined by Captain Crowley, First Mate Philip Caput, and Second Mate Duncan MacLeod. Captain Crowley told them that since the ship lost power, they couldn't send a distress signal, meaning no one knew that their ship was in trouble, but they hoped that the Townsend or some other nearby ship would find them. The life raft had a small storage locker which contained a flare gun, as well as other emergency equipment, but the captain told the men waiting on the life raft to not open the locker until they ended up in the water. Despite the severity of the situation, everyone on board remained calm. Meanwhile, the crack in the ship's hull continued to get bigger, and the two sections of the ship grinding together caused a huge shower of sparks that rained down on the deck. And then, Hale and his shipmates experienced what would be every sailor's nightmare. From the already huge crack in her hull, a huge blast of steam was released from the opening in the crack, and the force generated from the blast caused the two sections of the massive ship to completely separate. And now, both the bow and the stern were moving completely separate from each other. However, the boilers in the ship's stern were still intact, and the stern began to steam forward on its own. Hale described the scene as looking like a horrible monster being unleashed. The stern, still moving on its own, began to scrape along the port side of the bow section, which is where much of the crew were. The lights in the stern were still on, and the crew in the bow were able to see the massive open cargo holds in the stern as it steamed past. Just then, a massive wave crashed over the bow and threw the raft and everyone in it into the churning seas. It had only been 8 minutes since the Morrell began breaking up, and now the crew was faced with an enormous challenge. Hale was dragged deep into the frigid waters, but he saw the air bubbles rising and followed them until he finally reached the surface. Once he made it to the surface, he spotted the carbide light from the raft about 30 to 40 feet away from him. After fighting through the massive waves and troughs, he finally made it to the life raft and climbed aboard. There were already 2 other men on the raft when Hale made it on board, deckhands Art Stojak and John Cleary Jr. Shortly thereafter, they were joined by another crew member, wheelsman Charles Fossbender, who was on duty at the time of the breakup. The raft lifted and fell in the 25-foot waves, and the 65-mile-per-hour winds put all 4 men in a state of shock. They hoped that the Townsend or some other nearby ship would find them, but at this point they were alone in the vast waters of Lake Huron, and since the ship never sent out a distress signal, no one had any idea that they were in trouble. That night, it was clear that the weather forecast had severely underestimated the force of the storm, as the Morrell and the Townsend were not the only ships on Lake Huron caught off guard. At 1:45 a.m., just before the Morrell broke up, the 592-foot freighter Kinsman Independent was sailing north through Lake Huron with a cargo of coal. She was passing Harper Beach, Michigan when she ran into trouble. The ship's captain, Zerny Newmerman, was desperately trying to keep his ship on course. It was then that the 65-mile-per-hour winds were causing the ship to spin, blowing her far off course. She then fell into a massive trough where she couldn't get out. The ship became stuck in that trough for 4 minutes. It seemed that the ship would capsize. But then Captain Newman reversed the course of his ship, and the Kinsman Independent was finally able to break out of the trough and resume her voyage. Around the same time, several other ships were fighting similar battles. 450-foot Canadian freighter Howard L. Shaw was also sailing north through Lake Huron when she experienced a similar situation. Captain L.D. Jones of the Shaw reported that the winds were so powerful that the ship's wheels spun out of control, making it impossible for her to maneuver herself. The winds then caused the ship to veer 180 degrees off course. So instead of sailing north like she was supposed to, she was now sailing south. Captain Jones said it was as if his ship was being spun around like a top. Though fortunately, the Shaw, despite being 6 years older than the Daniel J. Morrell, managed to survive the storm as well. Then, just before 2:30 a.m., the 586-foot freighter Robert Hobson was sailing north only a few miles behind the Morrell, carrying a cargo of coal. Captain Charles Finch of the Hobson remarked that the conditions were, quote, "the worst continuously heavy seas I've ever been in." Shortly thereafter, Captain Finch decided to turn his ship around, knowing that it wasn't safe to continue sailing north, and the Hobson soon joined several other ships that were racing to the shelter of the St. Clair River. Around the same time, the 615-foot Harry Colby was struck by a massive wave which crashed over her bow. Her captain also decided the conditions were too much for his freighter. Then, the 504-foot Fred A. Mansk was also faced with a challenging situation. She had just turned south to take shelter from the storm, and she was rolling heavily in the monstrous waves. The Mansk was a self-unloader, and her captain feared that her heavy cargo boom would cause the ship to capsize if she rolled too far. Though fortunately, the ship made it through the storm unscathed. The captains of these ships, including Captain Connolly at the Townsend, reported that it was the worst storm that they'd ever been in. However, what these ships experienced is nothing compared to what happened to the German freighter Nordmeer. 10 days earlier, the 470-foot Nordmeer was carrying a load of rolled steel from Hamburg, Germany, bound for Chicago. The weather that day was calm, but that night, she suddenly ran aground on Thunder Bay Shoal, located about 12 miles east of Alpena, Michigan. The grounding caused all 5 of the ship's cargo holds, including her engine room, to flood, and she quickly sank in the shallow waters. Her captain and 7 crew members decided to stay on board to supervise any salvage operations that would take place on the vessel. But then, after sitting on that shoal for a week, the storm hit. The ship was being ripped apart by the unrelenting waves and gale-force winds for days on end. Finally, at 3 a.m. on the morning of November 29th, Captain Ernst George Steinbeck of the Nordmeer radioed the Coast Guard. Nearby was the U.S. Coast Guard vessel Acacia, which was also only about 20 miles or so from the Morrell when she sank, and the ship's captain remarked that if the Morrell had sent out a distress call, they would have likely been able to respond. But instead of the Morrell, the Acacia had received a distress call from the Nordmeer, and Captain Charles Milrat ordered the vessel to head in the direction of the wounded vessel. However, Captain Steinbeck of the Nordmeer had no idea if his distress call was received or not, so he and his crew fired some distress flares into the sky. The Acacia continued sailing in the direction of the German freighter, but Captain Milrat soon realized that the weather conditions would make it impossible for them to conduct a rescue. He changed course and turned south for Port Huron. The crew on the Nordmeer were anxiously waiting for rescue in the ship's pilot house, and even by the afternoon of November 29th, the storm was still raging, slowly tearing the vessel apart. But then, late that afternoon, the storm had lulled. The snow let up, and the wind subsided. Realizing that this was likely their only chance to rescue the men on the Nordmeer, the Coast Guard sent a helicopter to rescue the 8 men on the stranded ship. The break in the storm only lasted about half an hour, but in that time, the Coast Guard was able to lift all 8 men on the Nordmeer off the ship and onto the Coast Guard icebreaker Mackinac. After facing one of the worst storms they'd ever been in, the crew of the Nordmeer miraculously survived. Now the wreck of the Nordmeer has disappeared beneath the surface of Lake Huron and is now only accessible to divers. But other sailors on Lake Huron that day were not so lucky. Not far from where the Nordmeer went down, 4 men were anxiously waiting for rescue on a life raft. It's 2:30 a.m., November 29th, 1966. It has been roughly 20 minutes since the ill-fated ore carrier Daniel J. Morrell broke in two and sent her 29 men into the frigid waters of Lake Huron. 4 of her crew were waiting for rescue on a life raft, and only 1 of them would make it out alive, and one of them was Deck Watchman Dennis Hale. No distress call had been sent out from the Morrell, so the 4 men struggling in the raft searched for anything they could use to signal their location. One of the men, wheelsman Charles Fossbender, found a flashlight in the raft storage compartment and began waving it around to signal some lights he saw in the distance. The other 3 men soon saw the lights as well, and they were filled with a sense of relief, but they quickly realized that they were actually looking at the lights of the stern section of the Daniel J. Morrell, which was still moving on its own. completely separated from the bow. It steamed off into the distance and would travel for the next 90 minutes or so before it finally sank 5 miles away from where the bow sank. The 4 men on the raft now believed that they were the only crew members to have made it off the Morrell alive. The raft was battered by the 25-foot waves and gale-force wind, and the 4 men soon made some small talk about making out alive. Deckhand John Cleary soon asked Dennis Hale what their chances of survival were, to which Hale replied, quote, "A lot better than the guys who didn't make it out with us," unquote. They soon discussed how they would be able to stay warm and make it out. Hale soon felt his whole body go numb, and he later remarked, quote, "I suffered so much from the cold I was almost hoping to die," unquote. Hale then put his hands in his mouth to keep them warm, and he did his best to keep himself awake, as he knew that sleep would cause him to lose his life. By 7:30 a.m. that morning, the other 2 men on the raft, Art Stojak and John Cleary, all of them were now dead, and now it was just Hale and Charles Fossbender. Around the same time, the storm had weakened considerably, but the waves continued to rock the small life raft. By 2 p.m., Hale and Fossbender realized that they had been on the raft for 12 hours, but it appeared to Hale that Fossbender was holding on by a thread. During the sinking, his chest had been crushed and his shoulders were broken. By late afternoon, Fossbender had developed a terrible cough from his crushed chest, and each cough was more painful than the last. Fossbender soon told Hale that it felt like his lungs were blocked off, and Hale suggested that he try to cough it out. However, nothing happened. At 4 p.m., 14 hours after getting on the raft, it was clear to Hale that Fossbender was losing consciousness. He let out one more cough before his body finally gave out. Charles Fossbender was now dead, and Dennis Hale was alone in the vast waters of Lake Huron. Hale continued to drift in and out of consciousness, and at times he had hallucinations of seagulls attacking him on the raft. He feared that he wouldn't make it out alive, but little did he know, rescue was on the way. At 9 a.m. on the morning of November 29th, 1966, it had been almost 9 hours since anyone heard from the Daniel J. Morrell. At the Bethlehem Transportation Company's headquarters in Cleveland, Chief Dispatcher Art Dobson was waiting for the report from the Daniel J. Morrell. 9 a.m. was the time that the captains on the lakes were required to report their location and condition. Dobson soon received the report from the Edward Y. Townsend, but never received the one from the Morrell. However, since the vessel didn't send out a distress call, no one thought that the ship was in trouble. Many believed that her radio equipment simply failed in the storm, or she was blown off course by the wind. Morning came and went, and still no one heard anything from the Daniel J. Morrell. It was at this point that some were getting to believe that the worst had happened to the freighter, and she was lost in the storm. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, Captain Connolly of the Townsend reported that they last made radio contact with the Morrell at 12:15 a.m. And at that point, the Morrell was about 15 miles north of the Townsend. Dobson then contacted another Bethlehem freighter, the Arthur B. Homer, sister ship of the ill-fated SS Edmund Fitzgerald, which would tragically sink on Lake Superior just 9 years later. The Homer was supposed to pass by the Morrell at around the same time that Dobson radioed her, and he asked the Homer's captain to keep an eye out for her. He scanned the horizon, but there was no sign of the Morrell. The Homer's captain then tried to radio the Morrell, but he received no response. The hours continued to pass, and Art Dobson was now increasingly concerned about the Morrell. He once again tried to contact Captain Crowley of the freighter, but once again, no response. Dobson contacted a few other ships on Lake Huron, asking if they had seen or heard from the Morrell. Nothing. He still continued to ask the Townsend and the Homer to keep an eye out. Both ships also tuned into Channel 51, which was the frequency reserved for distress calls on the Great Lakes. Then, at 8 p.m. that evening, it had been 18 hours since anyone heard from the Daniel J. Morrell. At this point, Art Dobson had no choice but to believe that the aging freighter was lost on Lake Huron. Once again, at 9 a.m. on the morning of November 30th, the Morrell failed to report. Then, around noon, everyone's suspicions were confirmed, when the freighter CG Post found something shocking 8 miles east of Harbor Beach, Michigan. It was a body, and it was wearing a life jacket with the words Daniel J. Morrell on it. And at 12:15 p.m., 36 hours after she was last heard from, and 34 hours after the ship broke in two, the Morrell was declared missing. Fortunately, the Morrell's sister ship, the Edward Y. Townsend, survived the storm, though she didn't make it unscathed. She soon arrived in the St. Mary's River, where she would continue her route north to Taconite Harbor, Minnesota. She soon stopped at Lime Island to take on additional fuel. While she was fueling, Captain Connolly inspected his ship for any damage. While below deck, he found some popped rivets. This wasn't unusual for a ship sailing through a storm. However, while he was on the spar deck, he found a 2-foot crack in her number 10 hatch cover. This crack allowed nearly 4 feet of water to pour into her cargo holds during the storm. The damage wasn't too concerning, but Connolly feared that the Morrell might have suffered similar but more severe damage to her hull during the storm. Connolly reported the damage to the ship's owners, and the Townsend continued sailing north, before mooring at the Carbide Dock in Sault Ste. Marie. Little did her crew know, this would be the last time the Townsend would ever sail again. At 4 p.m. on November 30th, Dennis Hale had been on the raft for 38 hours. By then, the raft had drifted only a few hundred feet from the shore, but he didn't have the strength to move, and he feared that he wouldn't be able to survive another night. However, he soon heard a noise above him. A Coast Guard helicopter hovered over him, and 2 of its crew reached for his raft and lifted him into the helicopter, where he was then taken to the nearest hospital. Hale had spent 38 hours on the raft, and his raft traveled 19 miles from where the Morrell broke up all the way to the shore near Point of Barks, Michigan. He remained in the hospital for some time, but in the end, he survived. He would never sail again, and he soon returned home to his family in Ohio, and for many years, he refused to tell the story of the Daniel J. Morrell. In the months following the Morrell disaster, families of the victims were outraged that the ship's owners continued to operate the ship despite her extreme age. They were curious of her seaworthiness and why she was still sailing that late in the season. After all, her loss was fairly similar to the sinking of the Carl D. Bradley 8 years earlier. On December 5th, 6 days after the disaster, the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Board began an investigation into the sinking, which lasted until March of 1967. Bethlehem Transportation Corporation, which owned and operated the Daniel J. Morrell, eventually got sued by the families of the ship's victims, desperately trying to uncover the truth about the aging vessel. Soon, many came to testify about the safety of the Morrell. One of the first to testify was Len Harreville, the fleet engineer for the Bethlehem Transportation Company. He said that there wasn't anything wrong with the Morrell, as the ship passed all 3 Coast Guard inspections that she had in the 1966 season. However, he also pointed out that the Morrell didn't have any emergency backup system for her radio if the ship lost power, meaning that since the ship's power failed when she started sinking, she had no way to send an SOS. Then, Captain William Hull, who was the captain of the Morrell before being replaced by Captain Crowley in August 1966, also came to testify. He reported that in November of 1958, while he was the second mate of the Morrell, the ship was sailing through a storm on Lake Superior with 100-mile-per-hour winds and 25-foot waves. The Morrell made it through that storm unscathed, but that same storm sank the younger Carl D. Bradley on Lake Michigan. Thomas Burns, who was the Morrell's third mate at the time and who also retired in August 1966, also reported that the Morrell was in good shape when he left the ship. But then Captain Connolly of the Morrell's sister, the Edward Y. Townsend, testified that the weather forecast had severely underestimated the force of that storm. He said that it was the worst storm he'd ever seen in his 27 years on the lakes. Some of the captains who were on Lake Huron that night also testified that the storm was much worse than originally forecasted. On December 23rd, while he was still in the hospital recovering from his injuries, Dennis Hale testified that when he joined the crew of the Morrell in 1964, he found countless loose rivets below deck, and many of them were leaking. He reported that more than 1,000 rivets needed to be replaced. However, his testimony was soon refuted by officials from the ship's owners, inspectors, and former Captain William Hull, saying that the ship did not have that many rivets that needed to be replaced. But Captain Hull admitted that the ship did have some rivets that needed to be replaced. But Hill was adamant that the ship was not seaworthy, and he even went as far as saying that the Morrell was leaking like a sieve. And as the months passed, more and more people gave their thoughts on what happened. At the same time that the investigations were underway, the Edward Y. Townsend, which was still docked in Sault Ste. Marie, underwent a heavy weather inspection from the U.S. Coast Guard. Captain Connolly told the inspectors that he found a 2-foot crack in the Townsend's hull after she made it through the storm. Because of this, the Townsend did not pass the inspection, and she was towed to a dry dock for a more thorough inspection. It was during this inspection that countless fractures were found throughout the Townsend's hull. The damage was so extensive that she was stripped of her sailing papers. She remained in layup for the next 2 years before being sold for scrap in September of 1968. On September 15th, she began her tow from Port Colborne, Ontario, bound for a scrapyard located in Spain. She passed Quebec on October 1st and soon entered the Atlantic Ocean. But on October 7th, disaster struck, when the fleet encountered a massive storm. The unmanned freighter broke free from her tugs and split apart in a similar way as the Morrell, before she disappeared below the surface. She sank roughly 400 miles off the coast of Newfoundland. As of the making of this video, her wreck hasn't been located, but she foundered not too far from where the Titanic sank, though fortunately there were no casualties when the ship went down. The investigations into the loss of the Daniel J. Morrell continued on for the next year and a half, and on April 1st, 1967, the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, was created by the United States government. And from then on, it would be responsible for determining the cause of every transportation-related accident throughout the country. On February 8, 1968, the NTSB issued its own report on the loss of the Daniel J. Morrell, supporting the Coast Guard's claim that the ship broke apart because of brittle steel used in her construction. Although he didn't survive the sinking, Captain Crowley of the Morrell was cleared of any wrongdoing by the NTSB. The case was soon closed, and recommendations were issued to Great Lakes shipping companies, such as having survival suits on board, as well as other emergency equipment. But even still, after the disaster, Great Lakes shipping companies still prioritized profits over safety when it came to the operation of lake freighters, and the Daniel J. Morrell would not be the last shipwreck on the Great Lakes. Just 9 years after her fateful end, another lake freighter, larger and more advanced than the Morrell, would succumb to another fierce November witch, and take all of her crew down with her. That ship would be the infamous Edmund Fitzgerald. In mid-December 1966, the Bethlehem Steel Corporation hired a Canadian diving company named McQueen Marine to locate the wreck of the Daniel J. Morrell. However, bad weather prevented them from searching. Then, on January 6, 1967, a Navy aircraft was flying over the lake when it detected a magnetic anomaly 16 miles north of Point Barks, Michigan. Believing that they found the wreck of the Daniel J. Morrell, the Coast Guard hired Ocean Systems, based in Alexandria, Michigan, to scan the wreck. Ocean Systems chartered the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Bramble to head out and take photos of the wreck and prove it was what they were looking for. After an extensive scan of the wreck, it was confirmed to be the stern section of the Daniel J. Morrell. The stern sits upright on the bottom in 215 feet of water. Although the stern had been found only weeks after the ship went down, the whereabouts of the bow section would be unknown for more than a decade. But then, in May of 1979, shipwreck hunters David Trotter and Larry Copland found a large anomaly on the bottom of Lake Huron using side-scan sonar. The wreck was found several miles north of where the stern had gone down, and it was quickly confirmed that it was the bow section of the Daniel J. Morrell. The bow sits upright on the bottom in roughly 200 feet of water, 5 miles north of where the stern had gone down, and it was found that she broke apart in the exact spot where Dennis Hill had described it. Interesting, when divers went down to explore both sections of the wreck, they found that the clocks on the bow had stopped at 1:55, while the clock on the stern had stopped at 3:28, meaning that the stern would have been sailing on its own for approximately 90 minutes after the bow sank before she finally submerged as well. And with both discoveries, the families of the men lost on the Daniel J. Morrell could finally get some closure. But for many years after the disaster, the ship's sole survivor, Dennis Hale, refused to share his experience of what happened that night. But after consulting with a therapist who suggested that he share his story, Hale did everything he could to make sure that the story of the Daniel J. Morrell is never forgotten. He wrote 2 books about his experience, and he frequently spoke publicly about the disaster. He passed away from cancer on September 2, 2015, at the age of 75. To this day, the story of the Daniel J. Morrell is mostly forgotten, but she still lives in the memory of many Great Lakes sailors and relatives of those lost during that fierce November witch. In November of 1958, the limestone carrier Carl D. Bradley had traversed the Great Lakes for over 30 years. She was once the largest ship on the lakes, and she battled many storms throughout her long career. However, behind her fresh coat of paint, the ship's hull was rapidly aging. Her crew joked that she was held together with rust, but her owners were confident that she could survive the worst the lakes could throw at her. Little did they know, the 1958 season would prove to be her last. The Bradley Transportation Company, a division of the United States Steel Corporation, was founded in 1912 to operate a fleet of limestone carriers on the Great Lakes. Limestone is a vital ingredient in steel production, as it is used to remove impurities during the blast process. Limestone is also an important ingredient in the making of cement. Another division of U.S. Steel, the Michigan Limestone and Chemical Company, operated the world's largest limestone quarry near Rogers City, Michigan. To accommodate for the growing demand, the Bradley Transportation Company soon commissioned a fleet of self-unloading lake freighters. In 1923, the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio began construction on a new freighter labeled hull number 797 for the Bradley Transportation Company. She would be named the Carl D. Bradley, after the head of the Bradley Transportation Company. Ironically, she would be the second vessel to bear the name. The first Carl D. Bradley entered service in 1917, and was renamed the John G. Munson when the new ship entered service. She was later renamed the Irvin L. Clymer in 1951, and remained in service until 1990. The new Carl D. Bradley was launched on April 9, 1927, and she entered service in late July. At a length of 639 feet or 195 meters, the Bradley was the longest ship on the Great Lakes, earning her the title Queen of the Lakes, easily surpassing the previous Queen of the Lakes, the Canadian freighter Lemoyne. The Carl D. Bradley came in at 10,028 gross tons and was powered by 2 coal-fired boilers which fed a steam turbine engine that drove a single-screw propeller, which could generate up to 4,800 shaft horsepower, making the Bradley one of the most powerful freighters on the lakes. The Carl D. Bradley entered service on July 28, 1927, when she carried a cargo of limestone from Calcite, Michigan to Gary, Indiana. The ship was a self-unloader, meaning she could use her cargo boom to unload cargo at smaller ports without shore unloading equipment. During her early career, the Bradley proved to be a great success, as she transported limestone between Lake Huron, Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and occasionally Lake Superior. In 1929, the ship set a record for the largest cargo of limestone carried by a freighter on the lakes, at 18,114 gross tons. And in 1943, she became the first ship to pass through the brand new MacArthur Lock in the Sioux. Thanks to her size and power, she was often the first ship to pass through the Straits of Mackinac at the start of the season, operating as an icebreaker and clearing the ice for the smaller vessels that followed her. Since she was the company's flagship, she was held to a higher standard than her other fleetmates, often carrying company executives and always having a fresh coat of paint on her hull. The Carl D. Bradley held the title Queen of the Lakes for 22 years. She was finally surpassed by the 678-foot or 207-meter-long Wilfred Sykes, which was launched on June 28, 1949. Aside from that, her 30 years on the lakes were productive and mostly uneventful. Even by the late 1950s, she was still an important part in the limestone trade on the Great Lakes, and her owners believed that she would sail the lakes for many years to come. The Carl D. Bradley navigated the Great Lakes for 3 decades with little to no incidents. But on April 3, 1956, she collided with the MV White Rose on the St. Clair River. Luckily, damage to both ships proved minimal, but in May 1957, while she was dry docked in Chicago, several hairline fractures were found midship in her underbody. These sections were soon removed and replaced, and were deemed adequate by the Coast Guard. On February 26, 1958, the Bradley was inspected by Lloyd's Register of Shipping and was issued a new certificate of endorsement. Then, on April 17th, she passed an annual Coast Guard inspection, which deemed her seaworthy. But around the same time, the Bradley struck bottom several times. First in the spring of 1958 while she was departing Cedarville, Michigan. But the damage was considered so minor that no repairs were necessary. Then, in early November 1958, she touched bottom once again while leaving Cedarville, which gave the ship a roughly 14-inch traverse fracture. She was then repaired in Calcite, Michigan. However, none of these incidents were reported to the Coast Guard or Lloyd's Register, including the repairs made in Calcite. Her final Coast Guard safety inspection took place on October 30th, 1958, and she easily passed the inspection. However, it was clear to her owners that the ship was in serious need of work on her aging hull, and a major overhaul on the ship was planned for the end of the season. But until then, the Bradley continued sailing. By 1958, the Carl D. Bradley was under the command of 48-year-old Captain Roland Bryan. He had been the ship's master since 1954, and he was known as a heavy-weather captain. But he privately doubted his ship would be able to handle rough weather, and he was relieved that the ship would soon receive a major overhaul. On the evening of November 17th, the Carl D. Bradley completed her last planned voyage of the 1958 season when she delivered a cargo of crushed limestone to Gary, Indiana. She departed Gary at 10 p.m. bound for Manitowoc, Wisconsin, where she would be laid up for the winter. On this trip, she had no cargo and took on 9,000 gallons of water in her ballast tanks for stability. Ever since she left port, it was clear that Lake Michigan would soon be overtaken by a rough November gale. But the Bradley managed to hold her own in the growing storm. But as fate would have it, when she was only about an hour from arriving in Manitowoc, Captain Bryan received a call from U.S. Steel. Despite the rough weather, they ordered the Bradley to sail to Calcite, Michigan to pick up one last load of stone. The 1958 season had been a slow one for the Bradley Transportation Company, and most of their fleet sat in limbo. The ship's owners were not going to let the opportunity go to waste. Captain Bryan almost immediately diverted his ship to sail toward the open lake, but despite the rough weather, most of the ship's crew were unconcerned. The Bradley had survived much worse gales over the course of her long career. Most of her crew lived in Rogers City, Michigan, near Calcite, and many of them were eager to return home for Thanksgiving. By the evening of November 18th, the Carl D. Bradley was battling 65-mile-per-hour winds and 30 to 40-foot waves that occasionally broke over her deck. But the ship was holding her own in the storm, and it was a routine voyage for most of her crew. At 5:20 p.m., the Bradley's first mate, Elmer Fleming, radioed the port of Calcite, stating their estimated time of arrival at 2 a.m. the following morning. But little did her crew know, in less than 15 minutes, they would be in a fight for their lives. At around 5:30 p.m. on the evening of November 18, 1958, Frank Mays, a deckhand on the Carl D. Bradley, was on duty when he and most of her crew heard a tremendous boom somewhere deep in the ship, followed soon by a massive vibration. Soon, the ship's alarm sounded, and the crew immediately went to their cabins to grab their life jackets and raced up on deck. They looked back to the ship's stern, but to their horror, they saw the aft end of the ship rising and falling with the waves, pulling itself away from the bow. Her crew quickly realized what happened. The Carl D. Bradley had broken in two. On the bridge, Captain Bryan and First Mate Elmer Fleming were on duty when the ship broke in two. As the bow began taking on water, she started listing to port. Captain Bryan then ordered the engine stopped and sounded the ship's alarm for the crew to abandon ship. Meanwhile, First Mate Elmer Fleming began sending out a distress call on the ship's radio. Quote, "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the Carl D. Bradley. Our position is approximately 12 miles southwest of Gull Island. We are breaking in two and sinking. Any ships in the vicinity, please come to our aid." At first, there was no response, and Fleming kept repeating the distress call. At the same time, the two halves of the ship were constantly grinding and colliding with one another as the waves slammed into the hull. A shower of sparks began to form as the ship's top deck was being torn apart by the separation of the two sides of the ship. On top of that, the ship's two lifeboats were located in the stern. With the two halves of the vessel separating, there was no hope that the crew in the bow of the ship could make it to the lifeboats. Their only means of escape was the ship's small life raft. Meanwhile, Elmer Fleming kept repeating his desperate mayday call, praying that someone would respond. That evening, Ray Burnett, the radio operator at the WAD Marine radio station in Port Washington, Wisconsin, was listening to Channel 51, the frequency reserved for distress calls, when he suddenly heard the Bradley's mayday call. Burnett quickly ordered the other operators to clear the channel, and then asked for a position from the Bradley. The voice responded, quote, 12 miles southwest of Gull Island. Burnett then contacted nearby Coast Guard stations that could offer assistance, in the hopes of fitting the men on the Bradley, and soon, nearly every radio station on Lake Michigan heard the Bradley's distress call, including several of the Bradley's running mates, such as the Cedarville, the John G. Munson, and the T.W. Robinson, which all had crews with relatives on the Bradley. And upon hearing the news, the families of those on board became increasingly desperate. Meanwhile, the distance between the two halves of the ship grew, allowing more water to flow into the hull. The severing freighter was being punished by the 70-mile-per-hour winds and 20-foot waves that repeatedly smashed into the vessel, before suddenly a massive wave struck the ship and sent all 35 of the ship's crew into the churning seas. The ship's life raft was also swept into the water, and Frank Mays was soon able to climb on board. He then searched the water for any of his fellow crew members. First mate Elmer Fleming soon joined him on the raft, followed soon by deck watchman Gary Strzelecki and deckhand Dennis Meredith. The water around the ship was 46 degrees Fahrenheit, and the 4 men on the raft did whatever they could to stay warm. But now, the only thing they could do is wait. A few miles away, the German cargo ship Christian Sartori was also fighting her way through the storm when they saw the lights of the Carl D. Bradley in the distance. The Sartori did not receive the Bradley's distress call, but it was aware that the Bradley was nearby. Captain Paul Mueller of the Sartori estimated that they would pass the Bradley in roughly an hour, and he ordered a course adjustment for a port-to-port passing. But then, the crew noticed that the ship's lights started to go out, before the ship went completely dark. Suddenly, the ship erupted in a huge ball of fire, followed by a massive explosion that echoed through the storm, before the ship disappeared beneath the surface. Captain Mueller then checked his radar, but the ship was nowhere to be found. He immediately ordered the ship to sail to the area where the ship went down, but despite their proximity to the wreck, the storm hindered the ship's movement so much that it took more than an hour for them to reach the area. At the same time, the 4 men on the raft were struggling to stay above water as they were battered by monstrous waves. As the ship began its final plunge, the bow, already submerged, began to lift the stern nearly vertical, and soon the water reached the engine room, and when the freezing water reached the ship's boilers, a massive explosion ripped through the ship and created a huge cloud of smoke. And shortly afterward, the Carl D. Bradley began her final plunge and disappeared beneath the surface of Lake Michigan. It had only been a few minutes since she started breaking up, giving her crew almost no hope of survival. After the smoke from the explosion cleared, the men on the raft saw the lights of the Christian Sartori in the distance. They tried to light the flare they had on the raft, but the flare was too waterlogged to ignite. There was nothing they could do but pray that the crew of the Sartori would spot them. The crew of the Sartori lined the railings of the ship, looking for any trace of the ship and her crew. But when the ship's searchlights were scanning the water, the men on the raft were hidden from view as it fell into a trough. After failing to spot the survivors, the Christian Sartori called off the search and sailed away. At around 8 p.m., Captain Mueller reported to the Coast Guard, quote, "I believe all hands are lost. No lifeboats visible." As the Sartori sailed away, hope began to fade for the men on the raft. During the time in which they were on the raft, the waves flipped it over several times. The raft flipped over twice, and both times the men were able to climb back on. But another wave flipped the raft over once again. And unfortunately, one of the men, deckhand Dennis Meredith, was unable to get back on the raft, and the other 3 men couldn't pull him back up. He clung to the side of the raft for a few hours before the other men realized he was dead, and then they released him from the raft, and he drifted away. His body was never recovered. Now, it was just Elmer Fleming, Frank Mays, and Gary Strzelecki on the raft. But soon, Strzelecki began to lose consciousness, and just before dawn, he began mumbling about swimming to shore. Despite the other men's efforts to stop him, he jumped off the raft and began swimming away. They would never see him again. At this point, Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming were the only ones still on the raft, waiting anxiously for rescue. Almost as soon as the Carl D. Bradley sent out her distress call, several nearby Coast Guard stations began organizing a search and rescue, but the storm prevented them from mounting a search. But soon, the Coast Guard station in Charlevoix, Michigan deployed the 180-foot Coast Guard cutter Sundew to look for survivors. She arrived on the scene at 10:40 p.m. and was soon joined by the Coast Guard cutter Hollyhock from Sturgeon Bay, Wisconsin at 1:30 a.m. The storm was still raging when both ships arrived on the scene, making the search difficult. Meanwhile, word of the disaster reached the outside world. The families of the crew quickly went to the Charlevoix Coast Guard station, since they knew the survivors would be brought there. After several hours of searching, Captain Harold Muth of the Sundew knew that it was almost impossible for anyone to survive in the brutal conditions. But soon, one of the ship's watchmen noticed something floating in the water. Captain Muth peered through his binoculars and spied a raft with 2 men on it. The Sundew then sailed alongside the raft and carefully lifted the 2 men on board. The 2 men were barely conscious when they were brought aboard the Sundew, but they soon recovered. The Sundew remained in the area to search for any more survivors, and soon more and more ships began arriving on the scene. That afternoon, another ship spied a man in the water. It was Gary Strzelecki, who several hours earlier jumped off the life raft and attempted swimming to shore. He was still alive, although he was on the verge of death. He was quickly brought on board, and plans were made to airlift him to hospital, but only minutes after he was brought on board, Gary Strzelecki passed away, and the mission was aborted. The search continued on, but only bodies and debris were found. 18 bodies of the ship's crew were found, but 15 were never recovered. 26 out of the 35 crew on board the Carl D. Bradley were from Rogers City, Michigan, and almost everyone in the community lost a friend or relative in the disaster. 23 women were widowed, and 53 children, were orphaned. Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming soon recovered and were able to share what happened that night. An investigation was soon launched by the Coast Guard Marine Board, which concluded that the Bradley sank from excessive hogging stress on her hull, and that Captain Bryan underestimated the force of the storm when they left the protected Wisconsin coastline. They issued some recommendations to all ships in the Bradley fleet to prevent a similar disaster. Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming were adamant that the ship broke in two, and Vice Admiral A.C. Richmond, the Commandant of the U.S. Coast Guard, remarked, quote, "The extensive renewal of the cargo hold, planned by the company for the 1958 to 1958 winter layup, is in itself indicative of wear and deterioration. The fact that the vessel broke up and foundered under conditions which, while severe, she should have easily been able to weather, leads inevitably to the conclusion that the vessel had developed an undetected structural weakness or defect." U.S. Steel strongly disagreed with this conclusion and fought to prove that the ship was structurally sound when she sank, in order to avoid liability. Only a few months after the disaster, on April 20th, 1959, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers located the wreck using sonar, sitting just south of Gull Island. U.S. Steel soon gave $1.25 million that would be divided among the families of the victims, but still, the sinking put many families in a desperate financial situation since they lost their only source of income. Both Frank Mays and Elmer Fleming were insistent about what they saw that night, and both spent years fighting for the truth. In 1995, Frank Mays joined an expedition to dive the wreck of the Bradley and prove that she broke up. The visibility was terrible, making it impossible to find out. 2 years later, they tried again, and using an ROV, they were able to see the break in her hull, exactly where he described it. Frank Mays wrote, "I saw it go down in 2 pieces on the surface, and now I've seen it in 2 pieces on the bottom of Lake Michigan." Frank Mays spent the rest of his life sharing the story of the Carl D. Bradley, and he even wrote a book about his experience. He passed away in 2021 at the age of 89. On the 50th anniversary of the sinking, the ship's bell was recovered from the wreck, and was replaced with a new one that was engraved with the names of the 33 men who lost their lives in the disaster, eerily similar to the bell placed on the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald more than a decade earlier. To this day, the Carl D. Bradley remains the second largest shipwreck on the Great Lakes, only behind the Edmund Fitzgerald. Her story is mostly forgotten today, but she was one of the most successful and respected ships to navigate the Great Lakes, only to become another victim of the Witch of November. On November 10, 1975, a violent storm was raging over the Great Lakes. On Lake Superior, several ships were fighting their way through hurricane-force winds and monstrous waves. The freighter Arthur M. Anderson was one of them. The previous day, she had departed Two Harbors, Minnesota with a load of iron ore bound for Gary, Indiana. The weather was calm when she left, but only a few hours later, the storm began to churn up Lake Superior. Ever since leaving port, the Anderson had been following another lake freighter, the Edmund Fitzgerald. Both ships continued fighting their way through the storm for the next several hours, as they struggled to make it to the shelter of Whitefish Bay. But little did the crew of the Anderson know, the Edmund Fitzgerald would never make it to Whitefish Bay. She was found several days later, broken in two at the bottom of the lake, and her loss remains a mystery to this day. The Great Lakes are the inland seas of North America. They have a surface area of almost 95,000 square miles, and they hold roughly 20% of the Earth's fresh water, with the largest one, Lake Superior, holding about 13% of the world's fresh water, more than the other 4 Great Lakes combined. They, along with the St. Lawrence Seaway, are the busiest inland waterway in North America, and are vital for commerce in both the U.S. and Canada. However, the Great Lakes also have a deadly reputation, as thousands of ships have met their end in these frigid waters, many of them going down due to fierce storms that ravaged the lakes in the fall and winter, most notably being the White Hurricane of 1913 and the Armistice Day Storm of 1940. But over the years, as technology progressed, major shipwrecks on the Great Lakes were thought of as a thing of the past, as ships became larger and more advanced. However, deadly storms still continued to claim countless ships and mariners, and many captains were under enormous pressure to transport as much cargo as possible before the end of the season, or risk putting their entire career in jeopardy. But by the 1950s, shipping technology had improved significantly, and many companies were confident that their ships could weather any storm the lakes threw at them. And this is where the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald begins. In the 1950s, the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, based in Milwaukee, invested heavily in the natural resources of the Great Lakes region, which called for the construction of the Edmund Fitzgerald. They contracted the Great Lakes Engineering Works shipyard in River Rouge, Michigan, to construct the vessel. The ship was designed to be the largest vessel on the Great Lakes, while still being able to pass through the locks in the St. Lawrence Seaway, which at the time was under construction and nearing completion. Labeled hull number 301, her keel was laid down on August 8, 1957, and by June 1958, her hull was completed and ready for launch. When the ship was launched on June 7, 1958, more than 10,000 people came from all over the area to see the new ship take to the water for the first time, and a large flotilla of boats sat in the river outside the shipyard to watch the launch. She was to be named the Edmund Fitzgerald after the president of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, and she was christened by his wife, Elizabeth Fitzgerald. However, the launch didn't go exactly to plan. When Mrs. Fitzgerald attempted to christen the ship, it took 3 attempts to break the bottle of champagne on her hull. And then, when the shipyard workers tried to release the support struts holding the ship up, the ship didn't move. It took more than a half an hour before the supports were released. Then it happened. Her hull slid down the slipway and into the water. The impact created a massive wave which crashed over the dock and soaked some of the spectators in the crowd, and the ship continued to glide across the water before bumping into the other side of the basin. A Toledo man in the crowd by the name of Jennings B. Fraser was so shocked by the impact that he suffered a heart attack and died shortly thereafter. After her launch, the Fitzgerald was then brought into a dry dock, where she was fitted out for the next few months. At the time, the Edmund Fitzgerald was the largest vessel on the Great Lakes, earning her the unofficial title Queen of the Lakes, coming in at 13,632 gross tons and measuring 729 feet or 222 meters in length, easily surpassing the previous Queen of the Lakes, the freighter Cliff's Victory. And the Edmund Fitzgerald held the title for the next year, being surpassed by the freighter Murray Bay in September of 1959. The Fitzgerald was powered by a coal-fired Westinghouse steam turbine engine which drove a single 20-foot propeller for a top speed of 14 knots, and could generate up to 7,500 shaft horsepower. She had 21 cargo hatches that led into 3 large cargo holds that were each separated by a thick screen, with ballast tanks on the outside. Screens that separated the holds were not watertight, so really the ship only had one compartment. On older lake freighters, the crew would have to walk across the spar deck to get to the other side of the vessel, which is a dangerous place to be in rough weather. However, the Fitzgerald did have tunnels that ran the length of the ship. Her design remained similar to the blueprints that built nearly every lake freighter since the 19th century. She had a superstructure at the bow of the ship which housed the bridge, and a second superstructure at the stern which housed the crew quarters, galley, and her funnel, and the space between them was the cargo holds. So although she was modern and state-of-the-art for the time, her design remained similar to other lake freighters built decades earlier. The ship was fully completed in September of 1958, and she entered service on September 22nd. The Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company had actually commissioned the Edmund Fitzgerald to be chartered out to different companies, so the Ogle Bay Norton Corporation based in Cleveland had signed a 25-year contract to operate the vessel. After completing her sea trials, the Fitzgerald, under the command of Captain Bert Lampert, departed River Rouge bound for Silver Bay, Minnesota, where she would pick up a load of iron ore. When she reached the Sioux Locks, crowds gathered to watch the new freighter pass through on her way to Lake Superior. She then arrived in Silver Bay on September 24th, where she took on a cargo of 20,000 tons of iron ore. She then departed with her cargo bound for Toledo, Ohio, where it would be delivered to the Armco Steel Company. And when she passed through the Sioux Locks on her maiden return voyage, she broke the record for the most cargo carried through the locks by a single ship. She then arrived in Toledo, Ohio, where she was unloaded and her cargo of iron ore was delivered to the Armco Steel Company. She continued sailing until the end of the season, where she was laid up for the winter. At the start of the 1959 season, the Fitzgerald had a new master, Captain Newman Larson, and he remained in command of the vessel until 1966, when he was replaced by Captain Peter Pulser, and he remained the skipper until 1972, when Captain Ernest McSorley took command of the vessel, and he would be the Fitzgerald's captain for the rest of her career. A few months after the Fitzgerald entered service, another ship following very similar designs was being constructed. Laid down on March 18, 1959, at the same shipyard that built the Fitzgerald, Great Lakes Engineering Work for the Bethlehem Transportation Company, the design of the new ship was nearly identical to that of the Edmund Fitzgerald. She was named the Arthur B. Homer, and was launched on November 7, 1959, and unfortunately would be the last ship built by Great Lakes Engineering Work. The Arthur B. Homer entered service on April 20, 1960, and she remained in service until 1980. Both ships, although owned by separate companies, were considered by many to be sister ships, and both would have very successful careers. However, the Fitzgerald did have a few minor accidents over the course of her career. In 1969, she ran aground in the St. Mary's River, and in April 1970, she collided with the freighter Hochelaga. Later that year, she rammed one of the lock walls in the Sioux, and the same thing happened in 1973 and 1974. And on January 7, 1974, she lost one of her anchors in the Detroit River. And on May 20, 1992, it was found and recovered by divers. It is now on display in Belle Island State Park in Detroit. But these incidents were easily fixed and didn't pose a concern for the ship's owners. And the freighter continued to be an icon of the Great Lakes. In fact, while he was in command of the Fitzgerald, Captain Peter Pulser would get on the ship's loudspeakers to play music and tell her history as she passed through the Sioux Locks, and this gave him the nickname the DJ Captain. Then in 1964, she became the first ship to transport more than 1 million tons of iron ore through the Sioux Locks in a single season. She then bested that record in 1968 by carrying 1.2 million tons of iron ore through the Sioux that season. and in 1969, she set a new record for the most cargo transported by a freighter in a single voyage, at 27,402 tons of cargo. And that same year, a thruster was installed in the ship's bow, which allowed her to maneuver herself more easily in port without the need of tugs. Then, in 1971, the Fitzgerald underwent an overhaul where her boilers were converted from coal burning to oil burning. By 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald was still a favorite on the Great Lakes, and at only 17 years of age, many believed she would sail the Great Lakes for many years to come. In the early morning hours of November 9, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald, under the command of Captain Ernest McSorley, was docked at the Burlington Northern Railroad Dock No. 1 in Superior, Wisconsin, preparing for her final voyage of the season. Over the next several hours, she took on a cargo of 26,116 tons of iron ore, which was bound for the Zug Island Steel Mill in Detroit. After delivering her cargo, she was scheduled to head to Toledo, Ohio, where she would be laid up for the winter. But little did her crew know that several hundred miles away, a storm was brewing in Kansas and Oklahoma and was rapidly moving north toward the Great Lakes. The National Weather Service predicted that the storm would pass east of the Great Lakes and would be no concern. The weather forecast even forecasted the system as a, quote, typical November storm, but the storm would prove to be much stronger than initially thought. At 2:15 p.m. on the afternoon of November 9, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald was fully loaded with her cargo of iron ore, and she pulled away from the dock and out into Lake Superior. She had 29 men on board when she left, and little did anyone know that this would be the last time any of them would be seen alive again. When the Fitzgerald departed Superior, Wisconsin on the afternoon of November 9th, the weather was calm for that time of year, and it seemed to her crew that she would easily be able to finish out the season. Around 2 hours after the Fitzgerald left Superior, another vessel had left port with a cargo of iron ore. This was the freighter Arthur M. Anderson. Labeled hull number 868, the Anderson was built in 1952 by the American Shipbuilding Company in Lorain, Ohio for the Pittsburgh Steamship Company, a division of the United States Steel Corporation. She was launched on February 16, 1952, and she entered service on August 10th. Originally, she measured 647 feet or 197 meters in length, and came in at 11,623 gross tons. Her hull was lengthened earlier in 1975, and she was remeasured to 767 feet or 234 meters in length, and she now came in at 13,796 gross tons, making her slightly larger than the Edmund Fitzgerald. And around 2 hours after the Fitzgerald had cleared Superior, Wisconsin, the Anderson had left Two Harbors, Minnesota with a cargo of iron ore bound for Gary, Indiana, meaning both ships would follow the same route for most of their voyage. On this voyage, the Anderson was under the command of Captain Jesse Bernie Cooper. Not long after departing, the crew on the bridge of the Anderson could see the Edmund Fitzgerald about 15 miles ahead. Shortly thereafter, at 7 p.m., the National Weather Service issued a gale warning for Lake Superior. Soon, Captain Cooper of the Anderson established radio contact with Captain McSorley of the Fitzgerald. The storm intensified over the course of the night, with storm force winds of up to 52 knots and wave heights of up to 10 feet. At roughly 2 a.m. on the morning of November 10th, both ships decided to change course by sailing closer to the Canadian side of Lake Superior, which, although a longer route, would give them some shelter from the storm. By dawn, the storm had lulled, but the Weather Service knew it was going to pick back up, and soon they escalated their warnings from gale to storm. And at 3 p.m., the winds intensified from 5 knots to 45 knots, creating massive waves that pounded the freighters with relentless force. And soon, snow squalls descended over Lake Superior, reducing visibility significantly. So much, in fact, that the Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared from the view of the Arthur M. Anderson, and this would be the last time the Fitzgerald would be seen on the surface. Both ships were headed for Whitefish Bay on the southeastern end of Lake Superior to take shelter, but the storm was still pretty bad, and both ships remained several miles apart from each other. Soon the Edmund Fitzgerald was passing by Caribou Island, an island notorious for its 6-fathom shoals and other navigational hazards that lie just off the coast. Captain Cooper watched his radar, and noticed that the Fitzgerald was passing dangerously close to Caribou Island. At 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley called Cooper and reported to Cooper, quote, "Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I have sustained some topside damage. I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a starboard list. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish?" Unquote. McSorley then told Cooper that he had his pumps running, and they were able to keep pace with the flooding. However, it was quite unusual when McSorley said that his fence rails and vents were damaged, as it would have taken more than a wave to damage them. Some believe that as she passed over the shoals near Caribou Island, she might have sustained hogging stress on her hull, which would have flexed the ship enough to bend the rails. Others theorize that there might have been a large, heavy object adrift in the lake that smashed into the ship and taken down the fence rails and vent cover. But in the end, no one knows. And still, the crews of both ships did not seem very concerned, and both were making good progress through the storm. As dusk fell, the storm intensified, and the Coast Guard warned all ships on Lake Superior to get out of the storm and into safe harbor. The Sioux locks were also closed due to the weather, and both the Fitzgerald and the Anderson were desperately trying to get to the shelter of Whitefish Bay. That evening, the Edmund Fitzgerald and the Arthur M. Anderson were now 17 miles apart, fighting their way through massive waves that battered the freighters with relentless force, and winds of up to 96 miles per hour. the equivalent of a Category 2 hurricane. Unfortunately, around the same time, the Fitzgerald radar system went down. She was now sailing blind through one of the worst storms to ever hit the Great Lakes. With little other options, her crew searched for the beacon of the Whitefish Point Lighthouse, as well as the radio beacon at the station. But little did they know, the power in the area went out due to the weather, and even with the power switched over to the emergency system, it was out of range for the Edmund Fitzgerald. So at this point, the Edmund Fitzgerald had no way to figure out where she was. Captain McSorley called Captain Cooper and told him, quote, "I have lost both radars. Can you provide me with radar plots until we reach Whitefish?" Unquote. The Anderson's first mate, Morgan Clark, agreed. And now, the Fitzgerald would rely on the Anderson's radar to reach Whitefish Bay. Just after 5 p.m., Captain McSorley received a call from Captain Cedric Woodward of the Swedish vessel Avafors, telling him that the Whitefish Point Lighthouse beacon was back on, but it was still out of range for the Edmund Fitzgerald. And just then, the crew on the bridge of the Avafors overheard McSorley telling the crew not to go on deck, as well as the other crew members shouting. Not long after, Captain McSorley called the Avafors again, telling them that his ship had a severe list to starboard, his radars were lost, and the waves constantly broke over the deck. McSorley told the crew of the Avafors that it was the worst storm he had ever been in his 43 years on the lakes. The Arthur M. Anderson, 15 miles behind the Fitzgerald, was battling the exact same conditions. At this point, the Fitzgerald was only 35 miles away from the entrance to Whitefish Bay. It seemed that both ships would be able to make it to shelter. By 6 p.m., the storm had intensified once again, with 25-foot waves that repeatedly crashed over their decks, putting enormous strain on their hulls. As if things couldn't get any worse, at 6:30 p.m., the crew on the bridge of the Anderson stood in horror as a 35 to 40-foot rogue wave bore down on the stern of their ship. It slammed into the aft deckhouse, completely submerging it for a few moments as it raced across the spar deck before smashing into the pilot house. For a moment, the bow was completely buried by this wave. And then, another rogue wave, the same height as the first one, smashed into the ship once again, submerging the ship for a few moments before she resurfaced. Captain Cooper estimated those waves were about 35 to 40 feet tall, and if he was correct, then they would be taller than the highest recorded waves on Lake Superior, and Cooper feared that those same waves were headed towards the Fitzgerald. By 7 p.m., the storm persisted, but in about an hour or so, both ships would be in Whitefish Bay. Around the same time, the Anderson's first mate, Morgan Clark, told McSorley that another ship was passing by his ship in the opposite direction. McSorley asked if he needed to change course, but Clark told him that it wasn't necessary. At 7:10, just before ending the call, Clark asked McSorley, quote, "How are you making out with your problems?" And McSorley responded, "We are holding our own, going along like an old shoe." That was the last message ever heard from the Fitzgerald. Captain Cooper had returned to the wheelhouse right after the call had ended. He checked the radar and noticed that the Fitzgerald was only about 10 miles ahead. Just then, the weather started to improve, and the visibility increased. It was then that the crew on the bridge of the Anderson saw the beacon from the Whitefish Point Lighthouse in the distance, as well as the lights of several ships anchored in Whitefish Bay. However, since they could see the Whitefish Point Lighthouse beacon as well as the lights of ships in Whitefish Bay, they should be able to see the lights of the Fitzgerald there as well, but there was nothing there. Captain Cooper thought that the Fitzgerald might have suffered a power failure, so he asked the crew on the bridge to keep an eye out for the ship's silhouette, but they never saw it. One crew member on the bridge claimed to have seen a light in the distance, but Captain Cooper and First Mate Morgan Clark didn't see it. The crew checked the radar, but the area where the Fitzgerald should have been on radar was empty. They tried to contact the Fitzgerald by radio, but they received no response. Cooper then contacted a few nearby vessels to see if they had seen or heard from the Fitzgerald, but they didn't either. The Edmund Fitzgerald had simply disappeared, with no distress call or mayday. Captain Cooper called the Coast Guard in Sault Ste. Marie, but the Coast Guard was focused on searching for a 16-foot pleasure craft, and they told the Anderson to keep an eye out for it. At 8:25 p.m., Captain Cooper called the Coast Guard once again, and this time they listened to his concerns.
The last time that you talked to him, at what time that was, Willis? I'd have to check with the mate on it, but it must have been right around 7:15 our time, Eastern Standard Time. This is good, Roger. So also, did you come about or alter your course in any way to look for him over? Negative. I've got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not. 3 hooks were right up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. This is Group 2, and just for confirmation, sir, he couldn't see any lights pick him up on radar either, is that correct? No, I don't know. I thought we were picking him up on radar when I come up to the wheelhouse and talked to the mate. The sea return is real bad, but we thought we had the target. But I don't know. Now I wonder.
At 8:45 p.m., the Arthur M. Anderson arrived safely in Whitefish Bay, safe from the worst of the storm, and she remained there for some time. The Coast Guard had little in the area that could survive the storm. The 180-foot Coast Guard buoy tender Woodrush had left Duluth bound for the wreck site, but it would take several hours for her to arrive. They also had aircraft available in the area, but it would be difficult for them to take off due to the weather. The Coast Guard then asked the Anderson to head back out into the storm and search for any trace of the ship or her crew.
Do you think there's any possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching? Over.
I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going back out that way.
Cooper was hesitant to go back and search, but he thought that if it were his ship that were lost, the Edmund Fitzgerald would have gone back and searched for them. Shortly after, the Coast Guard asked other ships in Whitefish Bay to join the search as well, and only one ship agreed to join the search, the freighter William Clay Ford, under the command of Captain Don Erickson. After several hours of searching, the Arthur M. Anderson and the William Clay Ford found no trace of the Fitzgerald's crew. All they found was a debris field. By the next morning, November 11th, the storm had passed, and several other vessels had joined the search, such as the Frontenac, the Wilfred Sykes, Roger Blau, and several others. None of them found any survivors. But then, around 8 a.m., the crew on the Arthur M. Anderson found something shocking. It was half of one of the Fitzgerald's lifeboats, floating upside down. Captain Cooper claimed that it looked like a massive hand tore it in half, and later that day, the SS American Mariner came across the other half of the lifeboat. The Fitzgerald's other lifeboat was found that same day on the shore of Coppermine Point, Ontario by the local police. This lifeboat was also heavily damaged, but they had no trace of survivors in them, and it was quickly determined that they were not launched, but broke free from the ship when she sank. Around the same time, the Anderson also came across some of the Fitzgerald's life preservers and life jackets, and then they came across a massive oil slick near where she went down. And over the next few days, debris washed ashore on both sides of the lake. Then, on November 14th, a U.S. Navy P-3 Orion aircraft was flying over the Canadian side of the lake, about 17 miles from Whitefish Bay, only a few hundred feet from the U.S.-Canadian border, when it detected a strong contact using a magnetic anomaly detector. The Coast Guard cutter Woodrush came on scene and used side-scan sonar to survey it, to which they found 2 pieces of wreckage in about 530 feet of water. The wreck was scanned 2 more times. In the spring of 1976, an ROV was sent down to document the wreck, and it was confirmed that it was the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. She lies broken in 2, with both sections sitting 170 feet away from one another. The bow section sits upright on the bottom, while the stern section lies upside down and rotated about 130 degrees from the bow, and the lake bed surrounding the wreck is covered in iron ore that spilled out of her holds when she sank. Over the next few decades, numerous expeditions to the wreck would lead to countless theories as to how she sank. When the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald was located, she was found to have broken in 2, which led to many theories on how she went down. After all, she wasn't the first ship to sink on the Great Lakes after breaking up. 9 years earlier, in 1966, the freighter Daniel J. Morrell was caught in a fierce November gale on Lake Huron, when she broke apart and sank in roughly 8 minutes. Out of the 29 crew on board the Morrell, only 1 survived, Watchman Dennis Hale. And 8 years before then, in 1958, only 2 months after the Fitzgerald entered service, the freighter Carl D. Bradley was caught in a violent storm on Lake Michigan when she broke apart and sank. Out of the 35 crew on board, only 2 survived, Watchman Frank Mays and First Mate Elmer Fleming. Both the Morrell and the Bradley broke apart on the surface when they sank, but they were much older than the Fitzgerald when they sank. Bradley was 31 years old when she sank, and the Daniel J. Morrell was 60 years old when she sank. As a result, it's difficult to compare their losses with the sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and unlike with the Morrell and the Bradley, there were no survivors from the Fitzgerald. Some theorize that she nosedived to the bottom of the lake, and when she struck the bottom, she broke apart, and both sections separated from one another and sank. Others believe that she broke apart on the surface like the Morrell and the Bradley. It's also heavily debated on what caused the ship to take on water in the first place. Just before the Anderson lost radar contact with the Fitzgerald, the Anderson was struck by 2 massive rogue waves from the stern. Lake Superior has this phenomenon known as the Three Sisters, which are 3 rogue waves that come right after one another. The Anderson likely experienced this phenomenon when she encountered those 2 rogue waves, and the third one might have missed the ship. After those waves struck his ship, Captain Cooper feared that those waves were heading in the direction of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Another theory is that she struck the shoals that lay just off Caribou Island. Captain Cooper supports both of these theories because he saw on his radar that the Fitzgerald passed right over the shallows of Caribou Island, and right after that happened, Captain McSorley called Cooper and told him that he had taken a starboard list and lost his fence railings. But in my opinion, it was very likely a combination of several factors that doomed the Fitzgerald, as it is with nearly all shipwrecks. There are a lot more theories out there on how she sank, but we will not be going into them, and we will probably never know exactly how she took on water and how she broke apart, as there is not enough evidence out there to prove or disprove any theories. The morning after the disaster, at the Mariners' Church in Detroit, Father Richard Ingalls held a prayer service for the men lost on the Edmund Fitzgerald, ringing the bell 29 times, once for each crew member. And this became a tradition for the Mariners' Church, which they still do to this day. Finally, in July 1977, the Coast Guard released its report on the loss of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But this report ended up being quite controversial, as it states that the Fitzgerald's hatch covers were not properly secured, and blamed the crew for laziness, and later dives to the wreck would prove that the hatches were properly secured. The Fitzgerald story continued to gain attention by the media and general public, and in August 1976, Canadian singer-songwriter Gordon Lightfoot released a song called The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which became one of the most successful songs of his career, and is one of the reasons the Edmund Fitzgerald is as famous as it is. He passed away on May 1st, 2023, at the age of 84. And when the Detroit Mariners Church rang the bell 29 times for the crew of the Fitzgerald, they rang the bell a 30th time in his honor. At the time of the disaster, Edmund Fitzgerald, the person in which the freighter was named after, was still alive, and he was shocked by the news. He retired around the same time, and he attended the memorial service for the victims. He passed away in 1986 at the age of 90. Over the years, with the ongoing dives to the wreck, the families of the victims believed that the wreck should be declared a burial site, off limits to divers, and in 1994 they began a campaign to do so. The last expedition to the wreck took place in July 1995, which sought to recover the bell of the Edmund Fitzgerald. The original bell was recovered, and it was replaced with one that was engraved with the names of all 29 men who lost their lives on the Fitzgerald. The bell broke the surface of Lake Superior on July 4, 1995, and is now on display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Whitefish Point, Michigan, only 17 miles from where the Fitzgerald had gone down. Although the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald is now off limits to diving, pieces of the ship do survive today, such as the aforementioned bell recovered in 1995, and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum also has some other artifacts from the Fitzgerald. The Dawson Great Lakes Museum on Bell Island in Detroit has the anchor of the Fitzgerald lost in 1974, which was recovered in 1992, and is now on display just outside the museum. Also on Bell Island is the pilot house of the William Clay Ford, the freighter that joined the Anderson for the search of the Edmund Fitzgerald. When the ship was scrapped in 1987, her pilot house was recovered and put on display in Bell Island. The SS Valley Camp museum ship in Sault Ste. Marie has both lifeboats of the Fitzgerald recovered the day after she was lost, as well as other smaller artifacts located in various museums around the Great Lakes. Also, the Arthur M. Anderson, the ship in communication with the Fitzgerald on the night she sank, is still with us today, though she has since been upgraded, and since early 2025, she has been in an extended layup in Toledo, Ohio. And as of the making of this video, no one knows when or if she will return to service, but up until her extended layup, she always saluted the Edmund Fitzgerald on the anniversary of the disaster. To this day, the Edmund Fitzgerald is the largest shipwreck on the Great Lakes, and also the most recent shipwreck on the Great Lakes. It's because of the changes made to Great Lakes regulations after the Fitzgerald disaster that there has not been a shipwreck on the Great Lakes since. Before the Fitzgerald disaster, Great Lakes captains were under enormous pressure to deliver the most cargo on time and before the end of the season. The companies that owned the ships had profits as their #1 priorities, even over safety, which meant that even if a deadly storm was coming, they were required to deliver as much cargo on time and as late into the season as possible, or risk losing their careers. Nowadays, when there are ships in ports on the Great Lakes preparing to depart, and a storm is on its way, especially if the weather service underestimates the force of the storm, no ships are leaving port. But if they are, and they're already out on the lakes, they hug the shore, or seek shelter in a safe harbor. It's because of these recommendations that there has not been a single shipwreck on the Great Lakes since the Edmund Fitzgerald. Unfortunately, as it is with many disasters, whether it be a maritime disaster or not, it almost always takes a disaster for people to learn and for regulations to be put in place. It's estimated that there are between 6,000 and 10,000 shipwrecks on the Great Lakes dating back to the 17th century, and the Fitzgerald is the largest, most recent, and most famous shipwreck of them all. 2025 marks the 50th anniversary of the Edmund Fitzgerald disaster, and perhaps if she didn't sink on that fierce November night, she might have still been with us to this day.